Okay, well, I'll get started. First of all, my name is James Hayward, and I'm from After Class, and it's great to be presenting to italki teachers. It looks like we've got people from all over the planet, so some of you obviously are listening very late in the evening, so great to have you on board and for staying awake, and some of you very early in the morning also. So I started as an independent ESL teacher, and I'm currently involved in After Class, which is a web product, a software product, and we design content for teachers to use in online and in digital environments. So I'll be showing a little bit about that at the end, but in the meantime, I'd like to start to talk to you today about multi-word verbs, and in particular with phrasal verbs. A couple of months back, in fact, almost about 10 months back, I started doing a bit of a survey about what parts of the language people found easiest and hardest to teach. And one of the forums I was in, we were speaking about phrasal verbs. And as I drilled down into how teachers taught phrasal verbs, I actually understood that although people perceive phrasal verbs to be easy to teach and difficult to learn, it is an area of the English language that I believe teachers need a little bit of grammar, or more than a little bit of grammar, to really understand and to be able to answer the questions that students will ask, particularly because English is very rich in phrasal verbs and other languages have or don't have them at all. So I'm going to go through that today with you here now. So what I plan to cover, just quickly, there are two aims of the webinar. What I think your goal as a teacher should be realistically when teaching phrasal verbs, definition of a multi-word verb. There are different definitions available, and so I'm going to give you the one that I use. You may or may not choose to use it, but it's the one that I'll use and that should be applicable for this webinar. What I believe you need to know as a teacher. So first of all, there are some grammatical terms. Again, these differ throughout different resource and reference books, but I'll show you the terms that I use. And there are a couple of syntactic and semantic tests that you can use to decide if multi-word verbs belong to one category, if it's a phrasal verb, a prepositional verb, or a prepositional phrasal verb. You might wish to avoid all of that terminology yourself, but it's good to know it to be able to answer the questions that students will have, especially as they gain proficiency using phrasal verbs. Number 5, what a student really needs to learn proficiently. And then I'll demonstrate a couple of materials that I use to teach online and in person. So I'll move along quickly. Very quickly, I've got 7 examples here. Just you can write it down in your head or make a mental note. Have a look at them. All of them contain a multi-word verb. Maybe just very quickly for your own, it's not a competition, I don't need the answer in the chat, but just for yourself, look at each sentence and decide, is it a correct or an incorrect sentence using a phrasal verb? Each one does contain a phrasal verb. So I'll just give you a minute to have a look at those. Okay, I'm hoping that these are some of the errors that you have encountered when dealing with students who have questions or they produce this kind of work when using phrasal verbs. In my opinion, only A is correct. So here we have all of the phrasal verbs or multi-word verbs that are used here, but only A is expressed in a correct way. From B to G, they use the phrase, the student has used the phrasal verb, but unfortunately it's used in a way that is not correct. And so what I would like to do is show you that if you get something like this, you need to be able to explain why it isn't correct. And the first thing for a student and a teacher to understand is that you need to understand there are different groups. So the aims here today is to show you, are to show you the grammar required to teach the phrasal verbs, and then to show you some ways in which you can teach them online. As a realistic goal, what you want to do is for the teacher, is to teach the student to feel comfortable with some of the grammatic terms and the properties that different multi-word verbs have. You can't teach phrasal verbs to an extremely high proficiency, because what the studies show is that students need to know a little bit around the grammar, whether the phrasal verbs are separable, inseparable, transitive and intransitive, and then they actually encounter most phrasal verbs at a higher level of proficiency in the spoken environment. So as we get along, certain multi-word verbs are used particularly with academic writing. Others are avoided almost entirely in academic writing. And so what happens is, as students reach higher levels, you really need to have made them feel comfortable with the grammar so that B is in place. They must be able to use a dictionary correctly. There are studies now that show that if students have the grammar to understand phrasal verbs and in which group each phrasal verb belongs, they can then, with a dictionary, use them more correctly as they come along. And you want students to be able to work independently, have taught them, to have guided them, but for them to work independently as they get higher, as they reach a higher level of proficiency. So I believe that a student dictionary use for phrasal verbs, I believe, is vital. And of course, you will need to use a good dictionary. I don't have a great online one to recommend. Cambridge Advanced Learners, dictionary.com, they're great online dictionaries. Unfortunately, both fall short when it comes to phrasal verbs because they do not show the grammar properties and they don't show the group in which they belong. The printed ones are still the best at present. The Cambridge Advanced Learners is an excellent one as a printed one, but I'm still yet to find the perfect online dictionary to advise for student use. Okay, what is a multi-word verb? This is the definition that I use. It's short. You may or may not agree with it. I think it works out most of the time. It's simply a combination of a word and one or two other elements. So this is a slide from one of our lessons that we present when we first start to present phrasal verbs. You can start them at a fairly, I would say, maybe a B1, some B1 level, or a upper pre-intermediate level. It would depend on the student and your comfort teaching them. I present a few of these, and then you can look and see. Yes, yeah, sorry. So I present these 5 and ask the student to work out which one is not a multi-word verb. In this instance, number 4 is the only one that is a normal verb because its preposition is used as a preposition. And so when I talk about these 1 or 2 other elements, they're actually known as a particle. What you've got here is there are 3 multi-word verb groups. Phrasal verbs is commonly used even in a lot of the literature and even in a lot of textbooks to cover anything that uses a verb and a preposition or an adverb. However, I like the idea of phrasal verb, prepositional verb, and prepositional phrasal verb because these have very distinct grammatical properties, which means you can and can't do different things with them in the English language. First of all, phrasal verbs are the ones that we recognize immediately, but the second element, in this case, you've got look up, call off. So you've got the verb look followed by up. It's important for the student to understand that this is not a preposition here. It does not act as a preposition, but as the student would know, the 2 words together often have a meaning that is similar, but not necessarily the same as the 2 elements together. So up doesn't act as a preposition. In a prepositional verb, to decide on or to apply for, these do act as prepositions. And when it comes particularly to questions and to relative clauses, prepositional verbs can do things grammatically that a phrasal verb cannot do. This distinction might only really be relevant as you approach a higher level of written proficiency, but I think it's important for students to know. The last group of prepositional phrasal verbs Generally, there are two, and there can even be three elements in the sentence. So the ones we are very familiar with is to put up with, look forward to, run up against, perhaps not so much. They're a smaller group, but it's good to recognize them because one of the biggest mistakes that students make is to just simply drop one of those elements, and you end up with a bit of confusion, especially in question forms. Okay, as I mentioned before, a particle is not an adverb or a preposition, but it will look exactly the same. And if you look at A, we have I decided on the chair. We actually have a particle here. Decided on means I decided to purchase in this case. And so those two elements cannot be separated from each other. So it does not act as a preposition, and yet it looks like a preposition. In the second example B, I decided on the chair. The idea is that I decided something. I decided to take a holiday on the chair. I was physically sitting in that place. And because of that, you've got a preposition and not a prepositional phrasal verb. So the two verbs are decided on in example A, and in B, the verb is simply decided. This, of course, produces a lot of confusion for students. However, their natural instinct when they start to learn English is to see everything as a preposition, which is why when you bring in phrasal verbs and multi-word verbs, I believe it's important for students to understand that the form, it looks like a preposition, but it may not act like a preposition at all. And that really starts to help students to understand that a multi-word verb is always to a word and a different element. You can see here I mentioned before, if you have a look in the examples that come underneath A and B, the book which I decided on is excellent, and the book on which I decided is excellent. You can see here that the particle can appear in these places. Right. In terms of the different grammatical properties that groups have, the five most important as a teacher that you need to perhaps know for yourself in order to answer questions. The student may not need to know these five, but first of all, is the verb transitive or intransitive? This the student probably already knows, but it's vital with phrasal verbs because the majority of them require an object of some sort to make sense in English. Are the verbs separable or inseparable? There are far more separable multi-word verbs in English than inseparable ones, but you need to know both. As a teacher, I believe you would like to know the relative clause test and what we call the WH question test. These are only, again, relevant at higher levels, especially in academic writing, but they are certainly worth knowing so that you can at least advise the student about them. And then something which is quite important, which is the particle movement test, which is about whether you can move the particle or change places with the particle and the object. So I'll give you some examples of those. So here you have multi-word verbs, and of course there's even greater confusion when they can look the same but then belong to different categories. So in the first one, you can see that to take off, which means to actually fly, it doesn't take a direct object. It's therefore intransitive, and it gives the meaning of fly. There's no object here, and it's probably the first meaning of takeoff that students will encounter. However, we've got another one underneath. Again, it's intransitive, and it means to leave. So already you've got two meanings for the same one. Third, another intransitive sense. If something takes off, it succeeds. The fourth one becomes a separable transitive verb. It requires an object, and it also can be separable. So we could say Sonia took off her earrings, but also Sonia took her earrings off. So we'll go in and explain separable and inseparable. The same with the last example. She is taking 3 months off. She is taking off 3 months. Now, I'll just mention that my experience with British English and American English teachers is that there is some difference in the usage of separable transitive phrasal verbs. And my personal feeling, I haven't read anything about this, is that American English allows more separable transitive phrasal verbs than British English does. Okay, as I mentioned before, it's vital for a student to have a good dictionary. I believe at this point, although everything I do, I try to do online and in digital form, I am yet to come across a great online dictionary for use in understanding how to use phrasal verbs. So if anybody can share that, that would be great. Otherwise, I would still advise that the Cambridge Advanced Learners printed edition is a good one to start with. First of all, it's vital that your student has a good dictionary for phrasal verbs, but what you need to know as the teacher is the main verb will appear first, obviously, in the dictionary, and after that you will have the multi-word verbs, and the clue to look for is that there will be a pronoun somewhere. So you'll either have the indefinite pronoun something, someone, somebody, and it will appear either between the verb and the element or after the verb and element. Give up something, but it generally appears as give something up to show to the student already that this is a separable transitive phrasal verb. Okay, talking about the what we call the general particle movement, this is probably the thing that students will ask most. If you have a look at these examples on the left, these are examples of separable transitive phrasal verbs. And the reason that they're separable is that on the left, you can see in each of these examples that the object of the verb can appear between the verb, excuse me, and the particle. So I put my hat on, no problem. I can also say I put on my hat. And if we go to the right, the rule becomes that once that object becomes a pronoun, it must appear between the verb and the particle. So if you can make your students, when you guide your students to understanding phrasal verbs, this particle movement rule is very important. And when the pronoun is the object of the sentence, it must always appear between the verb and the particle for separable transitive phrasal verbs. You cannot say, I put on it. As far as I know, in any English, it's still incorrect. We looked up it, she jotted down them, it doesn't work. And that will be one of the first errors, and it's a very common one, especially in the spoken language. So direct objects, when they're a pronoun in separable transitive phrasal verbs, they must come between the verb and the particle. So here, this would be an example that I would give to students using separable transitive phrasal verbs to allow them to give them some ideas about authentic speech. It is hard work getting students to use phrasal verbs in an authentic manner because it's not easy to create the environment for them to use. They are typically used in more fluent, but not always, but in more fluent, as I said, and higher levels of proficiency. So what tends to be is there's an artificial environment where you can give some ideas to kind of guide the student into it. And here, this is something that I would typically do after introducing perhaps a group or a small amount of multi-word verbs that belong to the same group. I would then give some kind of guided discovery, hopefully with a little bit of vocabulary to help them use that. Obviously, a verb like check out, you can just about check out anything in English. We use, well, in spoken English, I believe it's used a lot. Put on is another example. Take something off is another example of phrasal verbs that can come in at quite a reasonably low level for students. Okay, here we've got some more inseparable transitive phrasal verbs. Another thing that I like to do is provide perhaps a more formal statement of the language. And then on the right-hand side, perhaps a multi-word verb that would be used, particularly in spoken English. So you can see here, I would ask the student on the left to go through and examine each scenario. The first one, Henry looks and acts like his father. And you can see at the bottom, we've got a multi-word verb, Henry takes after his father there. And you can start to explain that in fact this one belongs to a different group, but I'll go through that in a moment. Okay, the next group with which you need to be familiar are the permanently separated transitive phrasal verbs. These are a small group. They're used quite often, and this is one that I introduce after the separable transitive phrasal verbs and the inseparable ones, because the permanently separated ones mean that the direct object must always come between the verb and the particle. And you can see that in the example below. The idea of to let somebody or something off the hook is another expression we use. You can see that the object pronoun here must always come between. This verb is permanently separated by its direct object. And obviously down here, I've got an example that would be incorrect. So let off is a great one. There are about 8 or 9, I believe, that are used in common speech. They have to be memorized, unfortunately, this group here, but it is a smaller group. All right, so permanently separated. You've got also intransitive phrasal verbs. This, again, is a smaller group, and these tend to be a little bit confusing for the students because they understand that phrasal verbs, for the most part, take an object. So you will often get a redundant direct object at the end of the particle. So he dozed off it early last night is quite common. Blow up is probably the first one that you can introduce here, but again, it's important for the students to understand that no object is required at all in the sentence. However, some of these can be used in a way that's called an ergative verb, and they can take a direct object. So if we look at the example, the car engine blew up last night, you could also say that someone blew up the car, and therefore it becomes a transitive phrasal verb there as well. So there's a small group there you need to be familiar with as a teacher, but on the whole, an intransitive phrasal verb can't always be used in a transitive sense. Next, I'll go on to prepositional verbs. This is a group that not all teachers feel comfortable with, and in fact, not all teachers believe that this group actually exists. But this is the one I always think, when we do the word listening, in English, when you teach the verb listen, it's actually a prepositional verb, because we always listen to something. To always comes almost at the end of that verb. And so I find that this group is really interesting for students because it will be the first time they really start to encounter these mistakes that they've been making, to look at, to smile at, to listen to rather. These are prepositions that I believe we should have taught the very first time that students came across these, because they have a very particular, they tend to not change the meaning of the word, but it would be great if we taught these, because students would understand to group that preposition with the verb together at the same time. They're quite a large group, and as I said, they tend to reflect the meaning of the prepositional verb tends to be the meaning of the main verb, but not all the time. You can see on the right-hand side of the slide, called on is visited and means represent. So the meanings aren't easily discernible from the verb and the preposition, but it's a start. The last group are the phrasal prepositional verbs. These tend to be used almost solely in informal spoken English, but just almost. There are some that can be used in a formal written environment. So here you have a verb and a prepositional phrase. To come up with, put up with is probably the most commonly used of these groups. And the main thing for a student to understand here is there are two elements. You cannot drop them no matter how you use it. But of course, these ones are interesting because you can't use them in a relative clause. They won't sit. And the classic example is, this is something with which I will not put up. So it can become quite confusing for students to use these. So when you know that they're a prepositional phrasal verb, that they have two elements at the end, there is a preposition and a particle. Okay, so a couple of the rules that exist. If you look at this, the separable transitive phrasal verbs, you can see that in this instance, the noun can come after the phrasal verb. In Austin looked up the recipe in the cookbook. Afterwards, alternatively, the noun can actually sit in between the verb and the particle. However, if the direct object becomes a pronoun, it must always come between the verb and the particle for a separable transitive phrasal verb, and the pronoun obviously therefore cannot come after the phrasal verb. These are 4 good rules to learn for students to grasp the majority of what happens with separable transitive phrasal verbs. Okay, what I'm going to do is just show a couple of parts of how I would actually use teach. So let me just go, excuse me one moment. So as I said, this is a website that we've developed that has materials on it for independent ESL teachers. And we currently have a number of groups, one of categories rather of lessons. As you can see down here, we've got the group of about 35 verbs on, 35 lessons on phrasal verbs. I've opened one of them already for you to look at. And this is what when I teach phrasal verbs, this is the first one that I'll go to, which is a pure introduction. I'm just going to open that, and hopefully now none of you can see the teacher notes, but I can. So what I find to tend works well with phrasal verbs as an introduction is try to do a bit of a guided discovery with the actual multi-word verbs in place, and then go through and get students to elicit and to find out what they already know is quite important, so that you can then move on to a definition of a multi-word verb, how you can look for them, and then get students to actually start looking at ones I believe that they are probably already familiar with. The reality is with phrasal verbs, because they often have a meaning that is different to the verb and the particle together, you will actually need to go in and give your own concrete examples and lead quite heavily. There's not a lot of eliciting that can take place with phrasal verbs. I think it's quite important, as I said, I've focused mostly on the grammar for teachers here at this point, but I do believe that it's okay to introduce that for students. It takes time for them to grasp it, I believe so, especially for students where the verb is only one word. I think Spanish, for example, the verbs are constantly, the infinitive in English is 2 words for a start, and then in Spanish there are obviously, actually, you know what, I won't talk about that because I don't know a lot about how phrasal verbs work in Spanish, but it is important for students to understand in English how these grammatical terms work. Again, I showed you something like this before. I like to give some examples and allow students to pick those out, so it's a process of elimination, but it is a good indication to get them working on perceiving the definition, and then you can start as a teacher to adapt that and get them to try to make their own sentences. Here, again, scenarios, but they just need to match those up, and then I'll use the annotations online to hopefully get them to work those out. Once they understand what the meaning is, then it becomes a lot easier to describe the different elements, the subject, the phrasal verb, the object, and how it gets used. It becomes easier for them to start replacing some of those and make different sentences themselves. Then gap fills. I know some teachers are against using a gap fills too much, and I agree there's a limited benefit in it. However, I do think it's very important for structure for students to do gap fills, because you can then start to mess around with it. And especially if these are separable verbs, you can start to get the students to move around the object in the sentence, try putting them perhaps already into a past tense or into a negative, sorry, to change the verb into the negative. So there are things that you can do with gap fills that go just beyond filling that in. Again, more scenarios, and hopefully when you come to the end, you can get into something that is more into a free practice here. All right, so here there are scenarios, and hopefully the student can actually recall some of the ideas that were presented. A little bit hard. It is hard to find imagery that matches phrasal verbs without putting the phrasal verbs on the page. But what I've found is if you build up a scenario, you showed enough examples, hopefully the teacher can just guide the student in the end. Here we've got war, and hopefully the student will come out with put on. But again, it's not the easiest thing to elicit at any level, I find, with students. So we've got a variety of lessons that focus on the grammar as introductory lessons. And then secondly, we've got lessons that focus just on particular groups of multi-word verbs. So obviously you have a main verb that comes with the particle or adverbs, and some teachers don't agree with this, but I find it's nice to group them together: go in, go out, go about, go after. This is one way. The other way is some teachers group everything with the particle or the adverb. So take after, go after, but I prefer to do it with the verb. I don't know if there's research that favors one over another, but that's how I would go about that. So here we also have lessons that introduce particular groups, and we found that this becomes easier again if you provide scenarios, and after providing examples, and the students hopefully can start to produce some of those, use some authentic language there. Then the other thing I do with phrasal verbs is I follow up quite quickly with homework. It's one of those things that I think is important. Phrasal verbs are lost quite easily from the memory if they're not used. And obviously at lower levels of proficiency, students aren't using really authentic language. So it's great to promote it as much as possible, reinforce those examples. And so I generally, you can click on any of our lessons and the homework will actually appear. Here you can see again scenarios, and then hopefully how they would use that phrasal, how they would express that scenario with the logical option available. So multi-choice works quite well with phrasal verbs. It's not perfect, but it seems to, students seem to enjoy it. Then we've got a gap fill and hopefully a reworking where the students need to read the scenario and then express it another way. Again, all of these terms that are used in the homework have been shown hopefully previously in the lesson material. So we've built homework for phrasal verbs that comes directly from the content in the lesson. Nothing should be a surprise, and it should act as a good reinforcement there. So that's essentially how I approach phrasal verbs and the grammar that I think is important, mostly for teachers. The book that I recommend that you read is by Cowan, and it's simply called The Teacher's Grammar of English. It's quite a hefty tome. It was published, I believe, first in 2008. Some of the things he writes about phrasal verbs, you may or may not disagree with. I found it challenging when I first started because it certainly differed from what I was used to, in this idea of first of all showing that there were different groups, and some teachers probably have always taught just using the one group phrasal verbs, but as you get higher and you have different usage, the way students use these really, the way the English language uses these really is different, and you need to be able to explain to a student why a verb can do one thing but not another. I found that Cowan's chapter on multi-word verbs is extremely good. So just let me come back to. Okay, so that essentially was the presentation. I would be very happy to field any questions that you might have. I think Chris is with me today, so he can